Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. The development charity Oxfam has released a report titled Public Good or Private Wealth. The highlight of this report is that the wealth of 26 richest billionaires is equal to the wealth of 3.8 billion people who make up the world's poorest half. 26 people have the same wealth as half of the world's population. To further put this figure into perspective, 1% of the wealth of the owner of Amazon, who is the richest man of the world, Jeff Bezos, is equal to the whole health budget of Ethiopia. Not surprisingly, this report has made waves. Today, we discuss the key features of the Oxfam report, which include the increase in the world's billionaires' wealth, the increase in the poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, the gender wealth gap, and the importance of education and health provision services for equality in wealth. Moreover, we also talk about how the economic system in place allows for such an intense concentration of wealth in only a few hands. Joining us today for this discussion is Mr. Mohammed Hassan Kazilbash, who is the country director at Oxfam. Also joining us is Kamil Wazni, who is an expert on Middle Eastern, American, and economic financial studies. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Wazni, let me begin with you. So, when you read this report, was it surprising, alarming, or was it as expected?
This is not the first report that has been issued, and there is a great divide in the world. And income and inequality, this has been raised a lot of times. It has been raised during many protests all over the world. We all remember the protests, the 1% and 99%, where basically 1% of the wealth in the United States is concentrated on the small people, where the rest of the people do not have enough resources to live on. This is really capitalism at its worst shape, where the income has been concentrated on one place, and there is a great divide that's going around the world. I think we have the virtual economy, we have the stock market, which allow you to make unlimited appreciation in assets, and those assets eventually become a huge number. That's what happened with people who own Apple Computer, who own Microsoft, who own Amazon, who own a lot of things, basically here and there. I think it has been an issue, and this has to be actually tackled in a good manner, especially the decade that is coming with the artificial intelligence. Also, millions of jobs cannot be lost. So this will be more burden and more divide between the wealthy people and the unfortunate ones.
And Mr. Wazni, you've mentioned how it's not surprising because in the past we have been seeing a trend leading to the greater concentration of wealth. And for that, I'll take the question to Mr. Kazilbash. How the concentration of wealth has increased, has become even more intense. Before it was 62 individuals in 2016, and then it came down to 43, and now it's 26 people. What does the Oxfam report tell us about that?
Well, the report talks about, two basic elements. One is that, of course, as earlier mentioned, the concentration of wealth is amongst these 26, and it happens to be men, that own, and have this enormous amount of wealth. The other issue is around the taxation system, that the report looks at, if the taxation system is fair, we can use that money gathered and collected through the taxation system to address basic services, social protection, and benefit, the masses. What the report talks about is not only that the wealth is concentrated amongst these 26 individuals, but the fact that the entire system, the entire monetary system is geared towards protecting these 26 people and people like themselves, giving them access to tax havens where they are able to further accumulate the wealth over on an annual basis. So we here in Oxfam feel that as as proper duty bearers, as citizens of the world, there should be fairer taxation system, and that those tax money can be used to alleviate poverty for millions and if not billions of people.
And Mr. Qazilbash, I would like to talk about taxation more, but move on to that. Before, I want to ask, so many reports previously suggested that global poverty was decreasing, but this report seems to suggest that in areas such as sub-Saharan Africa, poverty is in fact on the rise. What can you tell us about that?
Well, you see, the report talks about inequality mostly, whereas even in a country like Pakistan, there has been, a reduction in the overall poverty of the country. Oxfam agrees with that. The issue is around inequality, that the haves are getting more and more rich and the poor are getting poorer. People who are able to even work, who have jobs, are still living below the poverty line. So the issue around is not just poverty, but more importantly, the inequality. And by that we mean, if there's a laborer working in a factory, he or she will be getting, less than the minimum wage. And even within that labor, the men will be paid more than the women. So the inequality is further dissected amongst the population, the women getting paid less for the same amount of work that their male counterpart will do. And that is what we have been seeing over the last couple of years, that the inequality has been increasing, causing more and more people to be poor, even though they may be owning land, they may be also having jobs and being able to work. However, their lifestyle is still below the poverty line.
Yes. And Mr. Qazilbash, something that the report seems to stress on is about how it's important to make sure that women get included into policy making and how their unpaid work is considered while we are talking about wealth. Can you tell the viewers, why is it important for wealth to be in the hands of women? Why is it important for them to be more participatory in the economic system for inequality to decrease?
Well, I mean, the idea of inclusion, of getting, men, women, minorities, people with disabilities all together to discuss, to formulate policies and to implement policies is the way to that a society progresses. If you exclude people from the decision-making bodies, if you exclude people from giving advice, then obviously the policies will be tilted towards one side. We feel, and we've shown repeatedly, that when women are engaged in decision-making, or when they are put in decision-making roles, when their views are considered and taken into account when formulating policies, those policies are more effective, are robust, and are fairer, and they benefit more people. And that's the position that Oxfam takes, that to include women in the decision-making process, to include women in defining and developing those policies in order for them to have a lasting and global and holistic impact. And we see it with whatever policy, whether it's health policy, whether it's policies related to education, water. The role of women is definitely something that is highly valued and important.
It definitely is, and something that Oxfam says here is free up women's time by easing the millions of unpaid hours they spend every day caring for their families and homes. What can you tell us about the hindrances in doing this?
Well, the hindrances are manifold. I mean, first and foremost, getting women to participate in getting elected into parliament. It's very important that women play a role in the election process, and that they come forward and become parliamentarians, decision makers, and leaders in that sense. Plus, also at the community level, at the household level, at all levels and strata of society. It is paramount to ensure that women have access to those decision-making roles, have a seat at the table in order to have effective and efficient policies.
And Mr. Qazalbash, hold on to that thought. I want to dig deeper into the features report. But before that, I'll move on to Mr. Wazni and ask him this. So Matthew Lesh of the Free Market Adam Smith Institute described the report as complete hogwash. And the reason for that is because perhaps it doesn't make sense to compare the richest of the rich to the poorest of the poor. In your opinion, does this report have any point?
Yes, I think this report has some merit, but if you just talk about the 26th richest person in the world, most of these people actually are giving their money away. If you take Bill Gates, actually has given his fortune, Warren Buffett has given all his fortune to the poor people. But you have to talk about the system that actually that needs to be adjusted around the world, especially with the rich countries that have the capability, they have the institution, they have the infrastructure, they have the financial literacy that does exist in these countries. They have the financial market where ideas can be challenged and can be funded by stock market. I think a lot of the problem that we are facing right now is the infrastructure of the financial instruments. And the exposure to the financial market is actually limited. That's what I've been calling for: financial literacy to share the prosperity that is taking place around the globe. We all know that even these companies who actually worth hundreds of billions of dollars were one time at the verge of bankruptcy. If you take, for example, Apple Computer in 1995 was on the verge of bankruptcy. It was bailed out by Microsoft at that time and became a $1 trillion company before we had that correction. So we all can participate, but you need that knowledge. And I think you need to see how we can empower people to gain access to the technology that is taking place, and we need policies that, in terms of taxation, in terms of fiscal policy, monetary policy, where it can be address some of these issues at the highest level. I think there were a lot of promises at the World Bank, there were a lot of promises at the IMF that can help, but their policy hasn't been effective in addressing these issues. I think the blame rests on the leader of the financial world. They haven't done their share. They're more concerned about creating conflicts and war than creating opportunity.
And Mr. Wazni, let me ask you this. So we've had reports in the past that state the same thing over and over again, create this sense of alarmism, and then it doesn't seem to translate into action. Do you think in the past there has been any substantial action taken place? And do you think in the future, after this report, there will be amendments?
If I understand the question, I think that the action that has been taken by the international community hasn't been enough to address the problems that we are facing in the world, because at one end of the equation, there's a party that supports a certain industry that sells weapons, that sell war, that sell destruction. If you look, for instance, in the Middle East, you will find that certain Gulf countries which are very rich in terms of their incomes, but most of their spending is on war and destruction. They have the highest spending on military. It goes like even some country 12% of their GDP, where that should be leveled and used for their empowering the people, because Lockheed Martin and Raytheon in the United States need to be profitable and to be wealthy. So this comes at the expense of that. We create conflict. These conflicts haven't been addressed, and that will increase the level of poverty throughout our region, at least in the Middle East. You look at the war that is taking place in Yemen, you look at the war taken in Libya, you look at the war that is taken in Syria, in Sudan, in Africa. It's all political conflict. But those conflicts are sponsored by political powerful countries. Look at the tension that is taking place now in Libya, the conflict between Italy and France over Libya, because this is supporting one group against that group. This has to be addressed not only at 25 rich people, but at the political influence that big country yield over the rest of the world.
And Mr. Wazni, before we let you go, I just want to ask you, there was mention of how, in the report as well, how the economies need to be reorganized, restructured to reduce inequality. What, in your opinion, is the way to do that?
Well, we have to get funding for that because actually the world is actually taking further steps to be introduced further into artificial intelligence, where we can be more productive, but it's going to come at the expense of jobs. I'm not sure those 800 million jobs we're going to lose in 10 years is going to be replaced by these new economic dimensions. But I think empowerment will start at having the wealthy country sharing some of the technology and the empowerment that we needed. And on the political level, they have to look at the interests of the people, not at the interests of their companies, how they can profit at our expense.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kamal Wazni, for joining us. We're going to continue this discussion with Mr. Qazalbash. Mr. Qazalbash, I'd like to ask your opinion on the criticism I pointed out to Mr. Wazni as well. How do you think, and if so, why do you think this is a fair comparison of comparing the richest of the rich to the poorest of the poor, 26 individuals to the poorest 3.8 billion people?
Well, it's not surprising that an institution like Adam Smith would call this report hogwash, because obviously this challenges the whole doctrine and philosophy of that institute. The idea of comparing it's talking about the concentration of wealth, that the fair division and distribution of wealth is what Oxfam is talking about. That with a fair distribution of wealth, you will have less poor people, you will have better access to basic services, you will have people living a dignified and decent life. That is what we are talking about. Accumulation of wealth is fine so long as it's done on a merit basis. But in many cases that we see, the accumulation of wealth is done through manipulating the system in order to benefit those limited individuals, whether it's creation of tax havens, whether it is policy formulation that will ensure that they remain rich and they are able to continue accumulating the wealth at a breakneck speed, and the poor remain poor. So, when we talk about how to address this, by simply raising or 0.5% extra in tax, if these 26 people pay an extra 0.5% of their tax, we will be able to address and remove over 1 billion people out of poverty. It's really very simple mathematics, but the fact is, we need to show and we need to focus on a better redistribution of the wealth rather than having the wealth in the hands of a few and making sure that it benefits a greater amount of people. And this report, last year, as you mentioned earlier on in your preamble, 44 people, had the equivalent amount of wealth as half the poor. Now it's down to 26. Who knows what happens next year? So it's directly related to the accumulation of wealth amongst the few, and as a result, the few benefit rather than the benefit of all.
And Mr. Qazilbash, just to get a sense of how alarming the situation is, the concentration of wealth, the number is decreasing and very few people having it. Can you tell us what the repercussions of this would be in the future if this number goes down even further?
Well, I mean, I see this as a man-made disaster, and like any disaster, the poor, the women, the girls, the children suffer the most. So with the continued accumulation of wealth, with fewer and fewer people, and the fact that the wealth is not equally distributed amongst the masses, you will see further polarization between the rich and the poor. And you'll see more poor people coming up. You'll see greater deprivation, suffering, malnutrition. The malnutrition figures will go up. The mortality rates will go up. Less and less people will get education. So in a sense, the disaster will continue to increase manifold.
And Mr. Qazilbash, another criticism at this report was its way of how it defined debt. If debt is higher than their assets, the person is poor. How would you respond to that criticism? And can you take us through the methodology of compiling this report?
Well, the report is compiled over a period of time. I mean, Oxfam takes great pride in its research, gathering data from its country offices, gathering data from the field, analyzing it, putting it together. We have teams of experts who then review the data, and triangulate and make sure that it is accurate, and then we put it out. It's not done, on an overnight basis. There a lot of effort and hard work is put into creating this report, because we understand the repercussions of this report. We understand the value and the importance of this report, and as a result, it is done through hardcore data analysis, data collection over a period of time, and then presented. We take many case studies from various countries and then put them together. The importance, the point that everyone really needs to focus on is the issue around inequality. We see it on a daily basis in many countries around the world, where even if they are developed countries, you still see the number of homeless increasing. You see the number of people just struggling to make ends meet growing, and you see the uber rich getting richer and richer. But there are countries that have started to address these issues. Costa Rica is a clear example of where inequality is being addressed in a very positive way, and we're seeing the fruits of that. Thailand, we're also seeing that happen. We're seeing it also even in a country close to us in Sri Lanka. So solutions are there. The possibility of stopping this and reversing this inequality is possible, but for that you need to have pro-poor policies, you need to have a fairer taxation system, and you need to use that tax money that is in a way that benefits the majority and not benefits the few.
Stay with on this and talk more about it, Mr. Qazilbash, but before that we're going to take a short break. Welcome back to Indus Special, and let's continue our discussion. We are now joined by Mr. Naseem Beg, who's an investment banker. Thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Beg, what I'd like to ask you is, between 2017 to 2018, a new billionaire was created every 2 days. How was this happening? What was happening on the investment end? Tell us.
Well, if we read Mr. Piketty's book, Capitalism in the 21st Century, or even if you go back, say, about 40 years, Dr. Ravi Batra, who brought these issues out, and both ended up recommending what this report is recommending, is a wealth tax of sorts. The fact is that it's clear that one set of elites will transfer the advantage to their children and so on and so forth. And Professor Stiglitz has also brought that out in his works in The Price of Inequality. So unless there is a concerted effort amongst the politicians to deal with it, and obviously on the other side, the pressure of the civil society. Now, unfortunately, in a country like in Pakistan, we've always had an elitist capture of the state, and therefore to expect the elites to kind of hurt themselves is not really a possibility, especially because most of them look at life in a very short-term perspective, and if need be, they accumulate wealth and move to wealthier countries. But if you take the other extreme, the US, again, there is a lot of noise on the elitist capture, the inequality. And if you go back a few years in the US itself, the two important decisions of their Supreme Court, a few years ago, the first one was giving a corporate entity the same fundamental rights as a human being, and then thereafter removing the cap on the contribution of election funding. So basically, it's become a $1, one vote society there, which is supposed to be the leader of the democratic world. And while we are still struggling to get into a democratic order. So to my mind, the investment per se, the return on investment has historically been higher than the growth rate of most countries, as demonstrated by Mr. Piketty, which clearly indicates that there'll be wealth accumulation as we go along. So unless there are reverses in this through taxation, and that's the only tool a government can use. We had a wealth tax law, we had an inheritance law. Both have been done away with.
Yep.
So that's really the issue we have.
And Mr. Baig, something that Piketty also mentions is a global wealth tax. Tell us about that and how that can be implemented and what use that can happen.
Obviously, when you have sovereign nation states, you cannot expect them to act globally on that score so easily. We've got global entities like the United Nations, etc., and they certainly do not extend their ability into going and taxing individual sovereign members. So that is, let's say, something that can happen way into the future. As a starting point, all countries, all member states, say, of the UN, would first have to start applying a wealth tax within their own jurisdictions. As I said, we've actually seen reversal of that in a country like in Pakistan. So there is, to my mind, no possibility. And if you look at what, say, Dr. Ravi Batra wrote 40 years ago, suggesting wealth tax, but not to deal with inequality, more so to deal with the fact that when you have a lot of assets, the state's machinery is used to protect your assets. And if you sit back and think that everyone else in the country should contribute to protect your assets, it's a wrong notion in the first place. So you've really got a situation where you've got to have a movement at the grassroots level.
Yes, definitely.
And that's the only way that it'll change.
Yes. And Mr. Baig, something that you mentioned here was regarding inheritance tax, which I also want to ask Mr. Qazilbash. So inheritance tax is seen to be very unfair by the majority. And it seemed to be, it's even called a death tax. And polls reflect that even in places such as Britain, this tax is seen to be completely unfair. How can this be implemented, and what are the demerits and merits of it?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, gaining wealth on merit is fine, but when we talk about inheritance, when we talk about, people getting, gaining money, multiplying their assets, through inheritance or through manipulating the system or developing systems and policies that will benefit them, obviously that is something that is unacceptable. And it's interesting, what your guest was saying, that it's civil society's role to function as a check and balance, but it's also important for governments and for the individuals as well to look at how to live in a world that is fair, how to live in a world where everyone can have a decent life. I mean, even the IMF clearly states that investing in public services, investing in social protection, investing in education and health services in particular, will benefit the masses and will result in people living a decent life.
And Mr. Qazilbash, hold on to that thought. I also want to introduce another guest who has just joined us, Mr. Abid Suleri, who's an economist. Thank you so much for joining us. On that same point of inheritance tax, I want to ask your opinion. Shouldn't parents be allowed to leave their children whatever wealth they have, and why should society be interfering in it?
Well, of course, there are two schools of thoughts about it. One which is Sharia and Islamic, which of course would like to say that we should carry on with the existing system, and other is what is being adopted in other developed societies, which feel that inheritance should be passed on after paying a high liability or high taxation. And I think it's about time that in Pakistan we should have an informed discussion on this issue, not only among the intelligentsia and among the intellectuals, but also at the house of the lawmakers in legislative assemblies and in the parliament. I think this discussion, as well as the whole issue of land reform, we need to discuss it in the parliament, and we need to come up with a new social contract on this inheritance and on the land issue in Pakistan.
Mr. Suleri, how would you respond to the claim that the rich deserve their wealth?
Well, again, as I told you, that from an Islamic point of view, any religious leader would tell you that you pay 2.5% of zakat and your wealth is yours, and then of course your taxation. But in a welfare state, we also know that in order to deliver public services and in order to deliver public goods, state has to have some source of revenue, and that source of revenue is
Mr. Suleri,
your taxation on wealth. So it is a fairer taxation we are talking about.
And if we assume this existing in a secular state and this argument being put forth then, that the rich deserve their wealth, they've earned to accumulate it, how would you respond to that?
Well, I'm responding it to the ground realities of Pakistan. So, of course, in case of Pakistan, we need to see what the realities are, and the reality is that religion allows, one of the arguments brought forward is that religion allows concentration of wealth provided a zakat is paid on it. Or in one sect, even you don't need to pay zakat. But fairer taxation is extremely important. So we need to see that in Pakistan, how we can bring this economic and social justice, which is more close to ground realities and which is more close to the laws of the land. And if those laws are preventing our transition towards a welfare state, then we have to improve those laws.
I'll take the same question to Mr. Beg here, and the reason why I'm asking is because in this debate, this question continuously rises. Why do we think of the elite class as exploitative? Haven't they worked hard enough to accumulate their wealth? How would you respond to that?
There are two parts of it. One, that at times you have worked hard, at times you have not. There are the distinction between what is classified as earned income and unearned income. The unearned income are the rents of sorts. And when there is a capture of the state by the elites, they organize the structure such that they have a lot of rent seeking within the businesses, etc. they set up, or simply by owning properties, or simply putting money on deposit and earning interest, rent, whatever you want to call it. So at the end of the day, do they have a right to it? Even if one says that, yes, a person has gone and earned money, and not just the unearned portion of it, we do have income tax. We do have some form of taxation for a state machinery to run. I would like to see the person who's accumulated a lot of wealth and the state does not provide any form of security. And there's a free-for-all and anyone can go and loot and plunder the wealthy. So you have to pay the state machinery for looking after the wealth of the wealthy class. Who should pay for it? The poor people. Clearly what we are saying is it's their wealth, they have the most at stake. Or even if you take not necessarily Pakistan, a certain country, and let's say another country comes in and invades us, invades that country, takes over the assets of the wealthy. So you want to deploy an army, you want to do all of these things. Who should pay for it? The ones who have the most to lose. The poor person, and if I can use a term of Urdu out here, a bhuka nanga, has nothing to lose. So why should that person pay even a consumption tax? We quite justifiably go around trying to justify.
And Mr. Beg, hold on to that thought while I take the last question from Mr. Suleri here. How can economies be organized in a better way in order to reduce this inequality that we see today?
Of reorganizing the economy, perhaps we are talking of restructuring of a taxation system, and taxation system tax by definition, it is a tool to take from rich to distribute its benefits to the poor. And that can only happen if we are taxing the wealth, when we are taxing the income, and when we are taxing it in a direct manner. All sorts of direct taxation, it's not only regressive in nature, but it also taxes those who are otherwise not eligible or shouldn't be taxed for their income. So the more we shift towards and we somehow reduce our dependency on indirect taxation, the fairer the system would be. So in a fair system and in a fair economy, there must be direct taxation on wealth, direct taxation of income, irrespective of the fact whether it is coming from agriculture sources, whether it's coming from services, or whether it's coming from industry or manufacturing. And it's reduced dependence on indirect taxation. Only then we can think of going away from inequality. The second fact is it's not only about collection, it's about allocation. And allocation shouldn't confine to the mega capitals or the major cities of Pakistan or the provincial capitals. In allocation, it's not only National Finance Commission, which is there, a tool to divide from the federal capital to the provinces, but also we should talk of provincial finance commission awards, so that provinces, they know that which districts to allocate how much and on which merit. So this justified allocation system, I think, that would somehow give us the benefit of fairer taxation. Otherwise, we'll end up in a situation where we'll tax more and we will just spend it on Lahore, Karachi, Islamabad, Quetta.
And I take your point there, Mr. Abid Suleri. Thank you so much for joining us. And now, Mr. Qazalbash, back to you. So we're talking about criticism, and of course, since you represent Oxfam, I feel like it's imperative to let you respond to it. So Oxfam has also been criticized for having a left-leaning agenda. How would you respond to that criticism?
Well, I mean, I would say yes. I mean, it is a whether you want to call it a left-leaning agenda or a fairer agenda. That is what we really want to focus on. We want to see, the majority of the population living a decent life. And how that is to be attained requires a tectonic shift in policy, in wealth distribution, as well as in the governance structures across the world, whether it is using the modification of the capitalist system or whatever other system we can talk about. But the bottom line is that the poor are getting poorer, inequality is increasing, and we need to address this immediately. If not, then we will see chaos, we will see conflicts, we will see increase in death and devastation amongst the billions of people who are unable to access or unable to utilize the wealth of the world. And if we want to live in a world which is plagued with conflict, then yes, we continue down this road. But I'm sure, like all your listeners and your viewers, they would want to live in a world that is peaceful, that is secure, that benefits the masses rather than benefit the few.
Yes, and since we're talking about living standards here, Mr. Qazalbash, the report also mentions a key recommendation, which is about focusing more on health and education. Tell us the importance of that in terms of reducing inequality.
Well, it is a proven fact that improving people's access to quality education, improving people's access to basic health services, and including access to water and sanitation will improve people's lives, will make them more productive, will make them more efficient, will increase their functionality and ability to live a decent life. It's a well-known fact. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure this out, and that's what the report really wants to focus on, is improving access to basic services and social protection, which will ensure people living a decent life.
And on that point, I'd also like to pose a question to Mr. Baig here. Mr. Baig, when we talk about so much disparity, the globalized concept of the American dream, that if you work hard enough, you will get to a point which is comfortable, has that crashed? And also, have we overestimated how wealth determines our lives? Because, of course, Mr. Qazalbash here was also mentioning conflict. That also is an indicator and determinant of how our lifestyles have changed drastically.
I would first of all say that yes, the US dream seems to be on a downtrend. Let's not say it's over, but certainly there are a lot of US families that live below poverty level, like what they had in the 1950s and 1960s. Anyone coming out of school is not assured of a job. Even some fairly highly qualified children have had to spend several years without finding jobs. So there is a serious problem even in that society. At the end of it is the inequality that has grown. But if we talk of the conflict and chaos, when we talk of terrorism, etc., all of these are symptoms of desperation. It's desperation of the downtrodden, nothing to lose, no other way to handle life. So they go kill themselves, kill others in the process. So obviously this will only grow if we allow inequality to grow. And there are a lot of studies, including the book The Spirit Level, which clearly indicates within the US societies and states where there is higher inequality, there has been a higher level of lawlessness and a higher level of health problems. So it's pretty obvious. I totally agree. This is no rocket science, and I wouldn't call Oxfam left-leaning. I would say it's equity-leaning, and that is what the honesty is. And if you have an equitable society, it's best for all. Yes. While if you have a divided society, sooner or later something will give and will result in bloodshed, chaos.
Catastrophe.
The only difference is that some people look at it very short term, whether it's climate change.
Thank you so much, Mr. Naseem Beg, for joining us. It was insightful talking to you. And Mr. Qazalbash, when we're talking about all this, you also mentioned how there needs to be more emphasis on taxation, progressive taxation, which makes sure that equality is reached, and also, as Mr. Beg mentioned, equity is reached. But my question is, are we thinking of a utopian society? Is this even possible?
We in Oxfam believe it is possible, and it is possible so long as policymakers, decision makers, civil society, particularly women, are engaged in the formulation of policy, and the changes that will occur then will result in a more equitable lifestyle for millions. It is possible. There just needs to be a will to address that, and we feel that with reports like this and with our partners, and even with the private sector getting involved and engaged, because ultimately, for the private sector, these are consumers. If the consumer is involved in conflict, if the consumer is deprived of a decent lifestyle, they won't be able to buy the products. So it's in everybody's interest to have a policy that is pro-poor, that addresses the needs of the billions rather than the needs of the few.
Yes, and Mr. Qazalbash, how do we try to move forward now? What should be the next step after reports like these come out for the normal society, for all the key players involved?
Well, like Oxfam and many other organizations similar to Oxfam, we invite policymakers and decision makers to the table. We want to engage in productive dialogue with them in order to reconstitute and reformulate policies which then address these issues and increase the education budget, increase the health budget for countries, increase the social protection needs of the population. And we can do that through dialogue, through discussion, and by having the right people sit at the table in order for them to develop and not only just develop these policies, but then ultimately also implement them across the country. And we feel that it is ample time now. Ample time has passed that we need to do this as soon as possible in order to remain, in a country, on a planet that is free from conflict, free from hunger, and free from disease.
And Mr. Qazalbash, last question to you. With so many conflicts, with so many diseases, how should the international community see this as a priority, all that you've mentioned?
Well, I mean, it's obvious. I mean, if they don't take this as a priority, then what we'll be left with will be something that will be unacceptable to billions of people. I'm not talking just about millions. I'm talking about billions of people. And as a result of that, if we don't take this on not only as a global need, but also on the individual basis. I mean, I think it's also important for each and every individual, every citizen of the country, irrespective of their income and social status, needs to address these issues and needs to understand that in order for us to survive as a species, we need to ensure that we live in an equitable life and that, people just have a decent lifestyle. That's all.
And on that point, Mr. Mohammed Hassan Qazalbash will have to end. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We'll see you again tomorrow. Goodbye.